Mom, now that you're retired, don't you think it's time to free up some space? My son said it so casually, standing there with a glass of champagne in his hand as if he were making a harmless suggestion instead of dismantling my entire life in front of a room full of people who had just spent the last hour applauding my 42-year career. I remember the way the laughter faded not all at once but in pockets like air slowly leaving a room. Someone coughed, someone else set their glass down too hard. And I just stood there holding the small gold watch the school district had given me minutes earlier, its face still warm from my palm. I had imagined this day differently. I thought I would feel proud, maybe a little nostalgic, surrounded by family celebrating the life I had built. Instead, I felt something colder settle in my chest, something that didn't quite hurt yet but made it hard to breathe. I forced a smile, the kind I had practiced over decades of parent-teacher conferences and difficult conversations, the kind that kept everything from falling apart in front of other people. Of course, I heard myself say, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. Daniel nodded, as if that settled it. Ashley, standing just behind him, gave me a small tight smile, her hand resting lightly on his arm, not possessive, not affectionate, just present, like a quiet confirmation that this had been discussed long before tonight. I noticed then how coordinated they looked, both in soft neutral colors, like they belonged to the same picture, while I stood there in my navy dress, slightly out of place, like something left over from a different time. The banner behind me still read, "Congratulations, Margaret Collins, 42 years of service," the letters curling slightly at the edges from the heat of the room. And for a moment I focused on that, instead of the silence, instead of the eyes watching me, instead of the way my own son couldn't quite meet my gaze. "I'm glad you're all here," I said finally, my voice steady enough that no one would notice the shift inside me. "It means a lot to see how far this journey has reached, so if you're here with me tonight, I'd love to know where you're joining from." A few polite smiles returned, a few people nodded, grateful perhaps for something normal to hold on to, but I could feel it now, the change, the invisible line that had been drawn right there in my own living room. I set the watch down carefully on the table beside the cake, the frosting still untouched, the candles unlit, the knife placed exactly where I had left it earlier when everything still felt like it belonged to me. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound considerate. "We've been thinking about what's best for everyone, Mom. This house is a lot to maintain. And with the baby coming, we really need the extra room." The baby, I hadn't been told officially, not in any way that mattered, not with a phone call, not with a moment, just us two. Instead it arrived here, wrapped inside a justification, a reason to make space for something new by removing something old. I nodded again, because that seemed to be what this evening required of me, small quiet agreements that chipped away at something much larger. I glanced around the room at the neighbors, the colleagues, the familiar faces who had known me as Mrs. Collins, the dependable one, the organized one, the woman who never let things fall apart, and I wondered if they could see at the moment when a person realizes they are no longer part of the life they built. I picked up a napkin, smoothing it out between my fingers, more to steady my hands than for any real purpose, and in that simple motion, something shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could notice, but deep inside, where the shock was beginning to settle into something clearer, something sharper. Because if there was one thing I had learned after 42 years of managing classrooms full of restless children and unpredictable days, it was this: you never react in the moment, you observe, you listen. And then when everyone thinks they understand the situation, you decide what happens next. I left the party before the cake was cut. Not because I was upset, at least that is what I told myself, but because there was nothing left for me to do there anymore. The music had started again, too quickly, laughter returning in uneven bursts, as if people were trying to convince themselves everything was still normal. I walked past the kitchen where I had spent all morning arranging trays and polishing glasses. Every surface still carried the quiet evidence of my effort, a bowl of fruit placed just right, folded napkins lined in perfect rows, the kind of details no one notices unless they are missing. I picked up my coat from the chair near the hallway, the fabric heavier than I remembered, or maybe it was just the way my shoulders had begun to feel as I slipped it on. Daniel did not follow me, neither did Ashley. I could hear their voices behind me, blending back into the rhythm of the party, as if the moment we had just shared had already been filed away as something small, something practical, something necessary. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had that afternoon, a soft breeze moving through the trees lining the street. I stood there for a second on the front step, looking at the house, the same house I had walked into decades ago, with a toddler on my hip and a husband who promised we would grow old there together. The porch light flickered slightly, something I had meant to fix weeks ago, and I made a mental note of it before catching myself realizing that detail no longer belonged to me. I walked to my car slowly, not because I could not move faster, but because there was no urgency left in anything I did anymore. The engine started on the second try, the familiar hum filling the quiet space around me, and for a moment I just sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead at Nothing in particular. I tried to replay the evening in my mind to find the exact point where things had shifted, but the truth was it had not happened all at once. It had been happening in pieces over time, in small forgettable moments that only made sense now when placed side by side. Ashley reorganizing the kitchen without asking, Daniel suggesting I move my things into the smaller guest room last month, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room. None of it had felt like a warning then. Just adjustments, just changes that come with life, but now they lined up too neatly like steps in a plan I had not been invited to understand. I pulled out of the driveway, carefully checking both directions out of habit. Even though the street was empty, the houses on either side quiet with drawn curtains and dim lights. I had always liked this neighborhood, the predictability of it, the way evenings settled into a calm routine, but tonight it felt different, as if I were passing through something temporary, something I no longer belonged to. I drove without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car more honest than any distraction could have been. My hands steady, my breathing, even everything about me composed in the way it had always been when things became uncertain. But beneath that calm there was something else forming, not panic, not sadness, something quieter, something that asked questions instead of seeking comfort. Why now? Why tonight? Why in front of everyone? And most importantly, why did they sound so certain, as if the decision had already been made long before I had the chance to hear it? I stopped at a red light a few blocks away, the glow reflecting softly against the windshield, and in that stillness I realized something I had not allowed myself to think until that moment. They were not asking me to leave, they were expecting it, and that difference, small as it seemed, changed everything. I did not drive home right away. Instead, I found myself pulling into the small grocery store parking lot just 3 miles from the house, the same place I had stopped at countless times over the years to pick up milk or bread or something Daniel had forgotten to mention until the last minute. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that pale, steady glow that made it impossible to tell what time it really was. I turned off the engine but did not get out. I just sat there watching a young couple walk past my car, laughing softly, their arms brushing against each other, as if they belonged to the same moment, the same future. I wondered when that feeling had disappeared from my own life, not all at once, not in some dramatic way, but slowly, quietly replaced by routines and responsibilities that I had accepted without question, because that is what you do when you build a family. You give a little here, adjust a little there, until one day you look up and realize you have given away more than you ever intended. I rested my hands in my lap and let the memories come, not the big ones, not the holidays or milestones, but the smaller, quieter pieces that had never seemed important until now. Ashley standing in the doorway of the kitchen months ago, suggesting we repaint the walls, something lighter, something more modern. Daniel agreeing without even glancing in my direction, as if my opinion no longer factored into decisions about the very space I had shaped over decades. I remembered the afternoon I found my favorite chair moved from the living room into the corner of the den. Ashley had smiled and said it just fit better there. I had nodded because it seemed like such a small thing, but now I could see the pattern, not removal all at once, but repositioning, adjusting, shifting me further and further out of the center of my own home until there was barely a place left for me at all. A car door slammed somewhere nearby, pulling me back to the present. I looked up to see an older man loading groceries into his trunk, moving slowly, deliberately, taking his time, as if there was no one waiting for him, no expectation pressing him forward. And for a moment I envied that kind of independence, the quiet certainty of knowing exactly where you belonged. I reached for my purse and then stopped, my hand hovering just above it, because something else surfaced then, something I had not fully examined before. The conversation Daniel had on the phone 2 weeks ago. I had been in the hallway, just out of sight, not trying to listen but unable to ignore the tone of his voice, low, controlled, almost careful. "We just need to figure out the timing," he had said, followed by a pause. "Yes, she will understand. It is for the best." At the time I assumed he was talking about work, about some project or client, but now those words settled differently, heavier, more deliberate. I leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes for a brief moment, letting the pieces arrange themselves, not randomly, not emotionally, but logically, the way I had approached problems my entire life. This was not sudden, this was not a difficult conversation that had simply been handled poorly. This was a decision made in advance, discussed, refined, and then delivered at a moment when I was least likely to resist, surrounded by people, expected to maintain composure, expected to agree. I opened my eyes again, the realization clear now, not painful, not overwhelming, just precise. They had planned this, and more importantly, they believed I would accept it without question. I finally drove home just after 9, the house quiet in a way it had never been before, not because it was empty, but because something had shifted in how I felt walking through the front door. I set my keys down in the same small ceramic dish by the entryway, a habit formed over years, and for a moment I stood there listening to the silence, noticing how different it sounded when it no longer felt like mine. The hallway light flickered on with that familiar half-second delay, and I walked slowly toward the living room, passing photographs that lined the wall, moments carefully framed, birthdays, graduations, holidays, each one a version of us that had once felt permanent. I paused in front of one from 20 years ago, Daniel standing beside me in his high school graduation gown, his arm draped loosely around my shoulders, his smile wide and unguarded. I remembered that day clearly, the heat of early summer, the way he had looked at me afterward and said he could not have done it without me. I had believed him completely back then. I moved past the photo and into the kitchen where everything was exactly as I had left it that morning, the countertops clean, the dishes stacked neatly, the small pot still sitting on the stove from the soup I had made before the party. I turned the knob slightly, checking if it had been left on, even though I knew it had not. It was something I did without thinking, the kind of careful habit that comes from years of being responsible for everything and everyone. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned lightly against the counter, letting the coolness settle in my hands, and as I stood there I began to see it more clearly, not just the events of tonight, but the shape of the life that had led to it, the choices I had made without question, the way I had always stepped back just enough to make room for Daniel to grow, to succeed, to build something of his own. I had given him the larger bedroom when he was younger because he needed the space for his studies. I had taken extra shifts during the summers to help cover his college expenses. I had welcomed Ashley into this home with warmth, with trust, with the quiet assumption that we were all building something together. And somewhere along the way that assumption had changed. Without my permission, I carried my glass into the living room and sat down in the chair that had been moved weeks ago, now positioned slightly away from the center, as if even the furniture understood something I had refused to acknowledge. I looked around the room, noticing small details I had overlooked before, the new decorative pieces Ashley had added, the rearranged shelves, the subtle absence of things that had once been mine, and in that moment it no longer felt like coincidence. It felt intentional, not cruel, not aggressive, just deliberate, like a slow redesign where I had been gradually edited out. I took a sip of water and set the glass down carefully on the side table, my movements steady, my thoughts even and measured, because there was no panic in me now, no confusion, just a quiet clarity that settled in place like something long overdue. I had spent years believing that stability came from giving, from adjusting, from making space for others, but sitting there in that room I began to understand something different, something far more precise. Space is not something you give away without consequence, and once it is taken, it is rarely offered back the same way again. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes resting on the far wall where the clock ticked steadily, marking time in small, even intervals, and for the first time that evening I allowed myself to consider not what they wanted, not what they expected, but what I was actually willing to do next. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar, as if the world had decided to continue exactly as it always had, while something inside my life had shifted permanently. I woke up at 6:30 without an alarm, my body still following the routine it had known for decades. Even though there was nowhere I needed to be, I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the house, the faint sound of pipes, the distant movement of air through vents. The same sounds that had once comforted me now carried a different weight, as if they belonged to a place I was only temporarily passing through. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor and reaching for the robe hanging at the edge of the bed, the fabric soft against my skin, grounding me in something familiar. As I made my way down the hallway, I noticed the guest room door slightly ajar, the room that had once been Daniel's when he was younger than mine, when Ashley suggested it would be more convenient for everyone if I moved there last spring. I paused at the doorway, looking inside. The bed neatly made, the curtains drawn halfway, letting in a thin line of morning light, and for a brief moment I could almost see the transition clearly, not as a series of small adjustments but as a steady relocation of my place within this house. I continued into the kitchen where the sunlight stretched across the countertops, illuminating the small details. I had always taken pride in keeping everything in order, everything in its place. I reached for the coffee maker, filling it with water, measuring out the grounds with the same careful attention I had given to everything else in my life. And as the machine began its slow, steady rhythm, I leaned lightly against the counter, allowing myself to think, not emotionally, not reactively, but deliberately. Daniel would wake up soon. Ashley would follow their day, beginning with plans that likely did not include me, not in any meaningful way. And for the first time I did not feel the urge to adjust myself to fit into that absence. Instead I felt something else, something quieter but far more solid. I carried my cup into the dining area, sitting down at the table where we had shared countless meals, conversations, decisions that once felt mutual. I traced my fingers lightly along the surface, noticing a faint scratch near the edge, something small, something I had meant to repair. And as I did, I remembered another conversation, one I had almost dismissed entirely. It had been about a month ago, Ashley sitting across from me, her voice calm, her expression pleasant, as she mentioned how much easier it would be to renovate the house if there were fewer complications, fewer people to consider. Daniel had nodded absent-mindedly at the time, scrolling through something on his phone, and I had smiled because it seemed like an abstract idea, a future possibility, not something already in motion. Now sitting there with the morning light casting long shadows across the table, I understood the difference. They had not been discussing a possibility, they had been outlining a plan. One that assumed my quiet cooperation. I took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth steady and grounding as I considered what that meant, not for them but for me, because if they believed I would simply step aside, then they had misunderstood something fundamental, not about the house, not about the situation, but about me. I set the cup down, carefully aligning it with the edge of the table, a small precise motion that reflected the clarity forming. In my mind, I had spent years maintaining balance within this family, ensuring stability, smoothing over discomfort, but balance is not the same as surrender. And as I sat there in that quiet kitchen, I realized that whatever came next would not be decided in a moment of pressure or expectation. It would be decided on my terms with the same care and precision I had given to every other important decision in my life, and this time I would not be the one making space for someone else. Daniel came downstairs a little after 7, his steps familiar in rhythm but different in presence, as if even the way he moved through the house had adjusted to a version of life where I no longer held the same place. He paused briefly when he saw me sitting at the table, his expression neutral, not surprised, not concerned, just measured, like someone assessing a situation he believed was already understood. "You are up early," he said, reaching for a mug without waiting for a response. I nodded slightly, watching him pour coffee the same way he had done 1,000 times before. Yet something about it felt distant now, like observing a routine instead of being part of it. Ashley followed a few minutes later, her hair neatly pulled back, her movements efficient as she stepped into the kitchen, her eyes flickering toward me for a brief second. Before settling on Daniel, "We should go over the timeline later," she said softly, not secretive but not directed at me either. Daniel gave a small nod. "Yes, we need to finalize everything soon." Finalize, the word settled in the air with a quiet weight, and I noticed how neither of them clarified what everything meant, not because it was unclear, but because it did not need to be discussed in front of me anymore. I lifted my cup, taking a slow sip, allowing the silence to stretch naturally between us until it became almost uncomfortable. Ashley moved toward the refrigerator, pulling out a container and setting it on the counter, her actions precise, her tone casual. "I spoke with the contractor yesterday. They said once the space is cleared it should only take a few weeks to start the renovations." Daniel glanced at her, then at the floor. "That is good. We do not want delays, especially with everything coming up." Everything coming up again, that same vague phrasing that carried far more intention than it revealed. I placed my cup down, carefully aligning it with the edge of the table, just as I had done before, the small deliberate motion grounding me in the moment. "What timeline are you referring to?" I asked, my voice calm, not confrontational, just clear. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not long enough to appear uncertain but enough for me to notice. "We were just talking about making some adjustments around the house, Mom. Nothing urgent, just planning ahead." Planning ahead, I repeated the phrase silently in my mind, recognizing it now as part of a pattern, not an explanation but a deflection. Ashley smiled lightly. "We want everything to be comfortable for everyone, especially with the baby on the way. It is important to create the right environment." I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting their meaning. "Of course, comfort matters," I said quietly, and then let the sentence end there, not offering more, not filling the space the way I might have before. Daniel shifted slightly, his hand tightening around the mug. "We just think it would be easier if you had a place that suited your needs better, something smaller, more manageable." I met his gaze then, not with accusation, not with emotion, but with a steady clarity that made him look away first. "Easier for whom?" I asked the question, simple, direct, and left unanswered long enough for the truth to settle between us. Ashley turned back toward the counter, adjusting something that did not need adjusting. Daniel cleared his throat. "For everyone, Mom. It is just practical." Practical, the word echoed softly as I leaned back in my chair, considering it not as a justification but as a strategy, because practicality when used this way is rarely about efficiency. It is about control, about framing a decision so that resistance appears unreasonable. I stood up slowly, taking my cup with me, and moving toward the sink, rinsing it under warm water, the simple act steadying my thoughts as I listened to them resume their quiet conversation behind me, their voices lower now, their words indistinct, but their intention clearer than ever. They were not asking, they were proceeding, and in that realization something within me settled completely, not in defeat, not in acceptance, but in understanding. They had already made their move, and now it was my turn to decide how I would respond. That afternoon I did something I had not done in years. I left the house without telling anyone, not out of defiance but out of clarity. I took my keys from the same small dish by the door, paused only briefly as I glanced back at the hallway, and then stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me. The air felt different in the daylight, sharper, somehow more honest, as if everything that had been hidden inside those walls could not quite Follow me out into the open. I got into my car, and this time I did not hesitate. I drove with purpose, turning onto the main road and heading toward a place I had not visited in a long time, the office of the attorney who had handled most of our family's legal matters years ago after my husband passed away. The building looked the same as I remembered, modest, clean, professional, with a small brass plaque by the entrance that still carried his name. I parked and sat for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I stepped inside, I would no longer be operating on assumption, I would be dealing in facts. I walked in slowly, the soft chime of the door marking my entrance. The receptionist looked up, offering a polite smile, and I gave my name, waiting only a few minutes before I was led into a quiet office lined with shelves of neatly organized files. The attorney, older now but still composed, greeted me with a familiarity that felt grounding. "Margaret, it has been a while. What can I help you with?" I sat down across from him, placing my purse carefully on the chair beside me, my posture straight, my voice steady. "I would like to review the ownership documents for my house." He nodded without surprise, as if requests like this carried more meaning than the words themselves. He reached for a file, pulling it from the shelf behind him, flipping through the pages with practiced efficiency, the soft sound of paper shifting in his hands the only noise in the room for a few seconds. "Everything appears to be in your name as expected," he said, finally turning the document toward me, so I could see it clearly. My name, Margaret Collins, printed in precise legal text. Ownership sole and uncontested. I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not exactly, but confirmation, the kind that replaces uncertainty with something far more useful. "Has there been any attempt to modify or transfer this ownership recently?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He shook his head. "No, nothing has been filed or requested through this office." I nodded once, taking in the information, allowing it to align with everything I had observed over the past months. This was not about legal authority. This was about assumption, about expectation, about a belief that I would comply without question. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap. "If someone were to try to initiate such a change, what would be required?" He explained the process in clear, measured terms: signatures, verification, formal documentation, steps that could not be bypassed or quietly arranged without my involvement. I listened carefully, noting each detail, not because I doubted him but because understanding the structure of something gives you control over how it unfolds. I stood after a few more minutes, thanking him for his time, gathering the copies he had provided. As I stepped back outside, the afternoon light felt different than it had when I arrived, less uncertain, more defined. I walked to my car and sat down, placing the documents beside me on the passenger seat, not looking at them again because I did not need to. The information was already clear in my mind. They had been planning something, but they had built that plan on an assumption that no longer held, and as I started the engine, I realized something with a quiet certainty. They believed I was being moved out of my own life, but in reality they had just shown me exactly where I stood, and that knowledge changed everything. When I returned home that afternoon, nothing looked different, and yet everything felt altered in a way that could not be undone. The house stood exactly as it had that morning, the same quiet walls, the same carefully arranged spaces, but now I could see it clearly, not as a place I belonged to, but as a structure others had already begun to claim. I stepped inside, placing my keys in the dish with the same controlled motion as always, and for a brief moment I paused in the entryway, listening. Daniel and Ashley were in the living room, there. Voices low, steady, not arguing, not tense, just focused, the way people sound when they are discussing something they believe is already decided. I moved forward slowly, not hiding my presence, not announcing it, either simply entering the room as I had done countless times before. Ashley looked up first, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "You are back early," she said, as if she had expected me to be gone longer. I nodded slightly, setting my purse down near the chair. "I had a few things to take care of." Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing at Ashley before turning back to me. "Mom, we were actually going to talk to you later about next steps." Next steps. The phrase carried the same careful neutrality I had come to recognize over the past day, words chosen not to reveal but to guide. I sat down across from them, folding my hands calmly in my lap. "There is no need to wait, we can talk now." I watched as they exchanged a brief look, a silent agreement passing between them before Ashley leaned forward slightly, her tone measured. "We have been thinking it would be best to move forward sooner rather than later. It will give everyone time to adjust and make the transition easier." I nodded once, acknowledging her words without interrupting. Daniel continued. "We can help you find a place, something comfortable, maybe a small apartment nearby, so you are still close but with more independence." Independence, the word rested there between us, framed as something positive, something thoughtful. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to notice before responding. "That sounds like a well-considered plan." Ashley's expression softened slightly, as if she had expected resistance and was relieved not to find it. "We just want what is best for everyone," she said quietly. I inclined my head in agreement. "Of course you do." The room fell into a brief silence, not uncomfortable but anticipatory, as if they were waiting for something more from me, an objection, a question, a sign of hesitation, but I offered none. Instead, I reached for the small stack of mail on the side table, flipping through it casually, my movements unhurried, my demeanor unchanged. Daniel cleared his throat. "We can start looking this week if that works for you." I placed the mail back down, aligning the edges neatly before meeting his eyes again. "There is no need to rush, I will take care of my arrangements." The statement simple, direct, and left without elaboration. Ashley sat back slightly, her fingers resting lightly against her arm. "Are you sure we do not mind helping?" I allowed a faint smile to appear, one that carried just enough warmth to settle any lingering doubt. "I appreciate that, but I prefer to handle things myself." Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pressing further, because from his perspective the outcome remained the same. I would leave, and they would move forward exactly as they had planned. I stood then, smoothing my hands lightly against the fabric of my dress, a small gesture of composure. "You should continue your discussion, I will not interrupt." And with that I turned and walked out of the room, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving forward with the same steady pace I had maintained throughout the day. As I reached the hallway, I allowed myself a single breath deeper than the rest, not out of relief but out of clarity. They believed the situation was resolved. They believed I had agreed. And that belief would give them confidence, it would make them careless. And as I continued down the hallway toward my room, I understood something with absolute certainty. Sometimes the most powerful move is not to resist openly, but to let others believe they have already won. That night I did not pack a single box, I did not open a drawer or fold a piece of clothing or make any outward sign that I was preparing to leave. Instead, I sat at the small desk in my room, the same desk where I had once helped Daniel with his homework, where I had written checks, balanced budgets, and planned years of my life that had now quietly shifted beneath me. The documents from the attorney rested neatly beside me, untouched, since I had placed them there earlier, not because I did not need to review them again, but because I already understood what they meant. I reached for a notepad and began to write, not emotionally, not impulsively, but with the same structured clarity I had used throughout my career, a list of steps, each one deliberate, each one connected not to reaction but to outcome. I wrote down dates, timelines, names of institutions, accounts that were solely under my control, assets that had never been transferred because there had never been a reason to do so before now. I noted the utilities, the property tax, the insurance policies, every detail that defined ownership, not just in name but in function and responsibility. And as I wrote, I realized something that had been quietly forming since the moment Daniel spoke at the party. This was not about being asked to leave, this was about being expected to surrender something that had never been theirs to claim. I paused briefly, my pen resting against the paper, as I listened to the faint sounds of movement in the house, a door closing, footsteps crossing the hallway, the low murmur of conversation behind another wall, life continuing as if the decision had already been made, as if my role in it was simply to comply. I set the pen down for a moment, folding my hands together, allowing the silence to settle fully around me, and in that stillness I felt no anger, no urgency, only a steady, controlled awareness of what needed to be done. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out at the street. The same quiet neighborhood, the same soft glow of streetlights stretching down the block, everything unchanged on the surface, yet entirely different in meaning. I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the desk, picking up the pen once more, this time writing a single line at the top of a new page, not as a plan but as a decision, a clear point from which everything else would follow. I would not leave, not under pressure, not under assumption, and certainly not under a narrative that had been constructed without my consent. I closed the notepad, carefully aligning it with the edge of the desk, the movement precise, controlled, final for the night. As I turned off the lamp and lay down in bed, I allowed my eyes to close, not in exhaustion but in preparation, because tomorrow would not be a continuation of what they expected. It would be the beginning of something entirely different, something they had not planned for, something they had not considered. And as sleep settled in, I understood one final thing with absolute certainty. They believed they had already taken control of the situation, but they had overlooked the one element that mattered most. They had never asked what I intended to do next. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.